This is the first of a number, hopefully, of NosTerra Venture live events. I want to thank Menlo School for affording us this incredible facility to be able to have the conversation in. And that's just incredible. I want to thank Jeff Hawkins and Subutai Ahmad for spending their time with us. And the main purpose of this is, frankly, for people to learn, to have fun, get a chance to think. We're going to leave some question time at the end for people to ask questions. The intersection, I'd say, of how does your brain work, how do you develop your intelligence, and how do we apply that, and can it be applied to machine intelligence? And that's a very hot topic right now. And so it's actually very interesting to be able to bring that together. So I'm going to start with a couple audience participation, real quick and simple questions. Who thinks they understand how AI works? Raise your hand. All right, I got one definitive, a couple okay. Who doesn't have a clue on how AI works? Raise your hand. All right, and then the rest of you are kind of in there. You got a little bit of everything. That's good. So now, second question. Who thinks they understand how the brain works? All right. So I should parallel with that. Do you have kids? Because when you have kids, you get truly a new appreciation of how brains slowly develop their input. It's quite amazing. Who doesn't have a clue on how the brain works? All right. Yeah. Okay. So tonight's your chance to learn a little bit about both. What's interesting in that little sampling and something that I think about is everybody has a different set of experiences. And so everybody, had a different feeling and answers that question differently because of their experiences, because as Jeff and Subutai will talk about, their reference frames, their experiences and how they go and take this input into them. And it's only through the community of those experiences that we can really bring and leverage the intelligence and the wisdom across that. And that's what NosTerra is about. NosTerra, Latin for our world, is really about bringing a community together of diverse experiences with the understanding it's our one world and we are one team. And we need to go and figure out how to solve our problems with a philosophy of we are one team, and we need to take and learn from each other's experiences and find the right place to be able to solve those. Before we get started, I want to thank very much Menlo School again for this wonderful venue and the support from the staff. Very generous in their willingness to work with us, and I hope we can work with them much further. So with that, let's get started. It is truly a pleasure to have Jeff and Subutai with us. Jeff probably doesn't remember, but we were almost neighbors, but in Atherton, neighbors are a long ways apart. But as a fellow Cornellian, I've watched his engagement, whether it was with his computer skills in the development of the Palm Pilot, or whether it's his neurological insights to be able to really decipher how our brain works and to do that types of study. It's just really inspiring. So Jeff's not only a neuroscientist, but he's a best-selling author. Recently published 1,000 Brains, a new theory on intelligence, which we'll hear more about today, this evening. And then I'd also like to thank Subutai. Subutai is CEO of Numenta. He's also passionate, very passionate about these topics, and his goal is to take the insight about how the human brain works and apply it to next generation artificial intelligence types applications. I'm looking forward to hear how that transition goes and to create, I guess, a general purpose tool to be able to develop that. So with that, I'm going to let Jeff, you get to start us all off, and please tell us about 1,000 Brains.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us here, Dave. Thanks. Pleasure to be here. So I fell in love with brains when I was a young man. I was in college, basically. And I decided there was nothing more important to spend my life on other than understanding how our brain works. We all have a brain. We are our brain. Our brains are remarkably similar. We have different experiences, but we all have a brain. And it was one of the most mysterious things in the universe. It was one of the things we had the least understanding about. And I just couldn't take that. I was like, oh, we have to understand how this works. It's everything about humanity. It's everything we've ever done. All of our problems and issues and opportunities are created by our brains. That's what makes us unique. And so I decided to spend my career, my life, dedicated to understanding how the human brain works. It wasn't a linear trajectory, but the last 20 years, I've worked with Subutai, also Don Dubinsky, who's in the audience tonight. We've had a company called Numenta where we were essentially a dedicated research lab doing neuroscience theory. And we've made a lot of progress. We have a very good idea what's going on in good portions of your brain. I won't go into too much detail. If you want, you can ask questions later, but we study the part of the brain that's called the neocortex, which is the big wrinkly thing on top. It's about 75% of your brain. It's the locus of intelligence. We've really kind of cracked the code on what's going on there. The term 1,000 brains, in addition to being the title of the book, it's really reflecting the name of the theory. It's not that complex of a theory, but the details are quite complex. But I think Dave asked me if I would just try to, in a nutshell, explain it.
Please.
So let me go through that. The first thing to do is think about your brain. What does it do? It builds a model of the world. That's what it does. When you interact with the world, when you look at the world, when you touch things, when you move around, you're essentially building an internal representation of all that's in your head. It's like a computer-aided design model, something like that. It's literally a model of buildings and signs and letters and phones and microphones and things like that that's in your head. And how do the neurons do that? The brain is made of neurons. And we've kind of cracked the code on that. There's two things I want to mention, or three things I want to mention about this internal model. And that internal model makes you intelligent. The internal model is first of all, it's learned through interacting with the world. You can't learn without actually touching things and moving your eyes and moving about. It's not like just sitting there passively receiving data. You have to literally interact with the world and physically, and we can explain why to understand how the world works. But it's what we call sensory motor. The second thing we've learned is how this model is structured in your brain. And it's used something called reference frames, which is, you may know what that is if you're a technology type or mathy at all. But essentially, it's a way of structuring data. And the neurons have a clever way of creating like a structure for a building and a room and objects that you might interact with. And it assigns things you learn to this structure. And that works for things as simple as a coffee cup and things as complex as politics. It's all built on the same mechanism of reference frames. And in my book, I talk about this quite a bit, so I walk you through what it means. The third thing, and this is where the 1,000 brains come from, the big neocortex we talked about is divided into about 150,000 nearly identical parts. They're called cortical columns. You have 150,000 things about the size of a grain of rice that together make this big sheet, which make you intelligent. Each one of those columns, each one of those 150,000 units is doing the same thing. It's a repetitive algorithm. They're looking at different inputs. So some are looking at parts of your vision and hearing and touch. They're all doing the same thing. They're all actually learning models. So you have 150,000 modeling systems in your head, and we had to figure out how they work and how they interact. And even though they're the size of a grain of rice, they're very complex. There's about 100,000 neurons in that little column, 500 million synapses. These are very complex systems, and you have 150,000. That's why we call it 1,000 brain theory, because it's like you have really thousands of brains. And when you want to learn something, you don't learn it in one place. You learn it in thousands of these models at the same time. So that's where the name 1,000 brains come from. So this is the framework in which we can then understand how we learn about the world. And once you understand how all this works, and the details are complicated, but you can understand them. Once we understand it, then we can take that and we say, what are we going to do with it? Well, we can do it for lots of things we can do with it. We need foundational theories for education. We need foundational theories for psychology and psychiatry and mental diseases. But we can also use it to create tools for humanity, to create really sophisticated machine learning and AI systems that work like the brain. And that's where my partnership with Subutai comes in, because that's really what he's driving right now.
So if I can add something, I brought from home my toy.
Okay.
So visually, this is how I kind of, you lay this out that this, if you were to lay it flat, was the size of a
The brain, the neocortex.
The neocortex.
Yeah, it's about a dinner napkin size and about 3 millimeters thick.
Right, and I've got all these individual cortical columns. As close as I could get.
Okay, that's an interesting one.
They're vertical too, like columns. Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
So I got these elements in here, and in reading your book, I've got pixels from my eye go to individual, or groups of pixels go to individual cortical columns, but the entire eye is spread out across many, many of these cortical columns. So,
Right.
so that initial calculation in the neocortex in the back of your head, how do they piece that all together?
Okay, we're diving quickly deep. Okay, but we'll do it. This is a fascinating problem, right?
Welcome to use this.
We think that it feels like you're looking at a picture of the world and you're processing this picture. That is not true at all. And neuroscientists have known this for a while. There's no part of the brain that looks at the input from the eyes. I mean, the whole input from the eyes. Each little part of your retina projects to a small one of these. Each cortical column looks at a small part of the retina. And so each cortical column only looks at a little part of the visual space. But each one can learn by moving. It'd be like you could learn see, if you could only look through a straw, you could still learn what things look like and you can still understand things, right? But you have to move around. Now you got all these things processing different parts of the retina at the same time. Each one has models of the visual world. And each one only sees a little bit at once. And so what they do is they have a way of communicating with each other and voting on what's going on. It's like one person saying, I'm only seeing a little bit of this, I'm seeing a little bit of this, and I'm seeing a little bit of this, and I'm seeing a little bit. On their own, they may not know yet what it is you're looking at unless they all moved around. But they can vote with each other. And so this is why we don't notice when things are like, people talk about the blind spot, right? Well, why don't you see the blind spot? The blind spot's no different than the gaps between your fingers. When I grab this chair, I don't feel like, well, where's the rest of the chair? I'm only touching part of it, right? What's going on is the parts that are sensing the world, each one has an hypothesis of what's going on. They have a way of communicating, we call voting, and they reach a consensus very quickly. They say the only hypothesis that makes sense, that we all know about different parts of the world, the only one that makes sense is this one, and that's what you perceive. And so it's an illusion that you're actually seeing the world as a whole. You're not at all. Yeah. That is the output of the voting, which is not what you're actually seeing.
I find this really fascinating. I mean, just so many examples of this because so you got this reference frame and you're used to seeing something the way you're used to seeing it, right? And it's broken up into all these little fractal parts, right? And I'm sure everyone, or a number of you have seen the crazy gorilla that dances in the middle, goes into the middle and dances around, and then no one actually sees it until they slow it down and look for the gorilla, right? But and your brain patches over from its history what you think reality is.
Right.
Right.
And it fills in all the gaps from that, and it's easy to see from these crazy visual effects in there, but it's true in all things. You from your reference frame, you fill in what you think is reality until you really deeply stare and consciously try to unravel whether what you saw or felt or whatever is correct.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating aspects about that, and you kind of alluded to that, is that basic algorithm and structure that constructs our visual field and the visual percept of objects that we see out there. That's exact same algorithm and exact same structure is used for every aspect, every sensory modality, and every aspect of our thought. And this is one of the most remarkable findings, I think, in neuroscience. One of the top 10, it's the exact same structure, exact same algorithm. We don't have a visual algorithm. We don't have an auditory algorithm. We just have a neocortical algorithm that's embodied in these cortical columns, and every aspect of our thought is using that algorithm. And as a computer scientist, that's a fascinating concept. It's a simplifying
I just think it's worth. I think it's worth mentioning one more thing. You touched on here. I agree with everything Subutai said, but one other thing is, this is a hard to believe fact. Your perception of the world is a complete fabrication. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it is not. If you actually see what the brain is getting from its sensors, it's nothing like this. And so what you are seeing and what you are hearing and everything, your reality of the world is a creation of the models in your head. And I know it's hard to believe, it really takes a while to let this sink in, but everything here is a fabrication. Not, again, that it's wrong, but it's the models, it's the model you're perceiving, not the world. The world kicks in and invokes it. So this means that this is why we can have false beliefs. This is why two people can have the same place in the world and have a very different perception of what's happening. Remember the red, what was it, the red blue dress or something like that? It was a very simple example of that.
Right.
But we also have examples that are, political views and things like that, so we want to get to the nature of human problems and human opportunity. We have to understand how humans work, and that our understanding of the world is a fabrication of our brains, and it's a fabrication of the models we've learned. And we've learned different models, same algorithm, but different experiences lead to different internal models, and you have different beliefs and different perceptions. People really, literally perceive the world differently. It's amazing.
I get really passionate about this. I think you've touched on it several points that I think are truly fascinating. And one, and actually I learned this in your first book on
intelligence.
Yeah. And it was that all brain cells process all information in the same fashion. In that all they're seeing are these electronic triggers. They have the brain cell doesn't know where that trigger's coming from, your eyes, your ears, or whatever. It's just wired in a particular way, and it goes and creates this thing, and it develops it. At that time, it was really looking at patterns. They're using the word patterns, but now we've moved to the reference models, and that.
Well, that's getting what Subutai was saying, right? Where it's like the same algorithm.
Yeah, right.
Vision and hearing are the same thing, actually.
The example you used in there was for someone, I can't remember the details of it, but it's basically using the sensory of your tongue to see.
Yeah, that's a...
Right?
Yeah.
If you could connect the sensor to the neurons on your tongue, you could actually teach your brain to see. Not at the same clarity, but it was still interesting to see that that pattern introduced to your brain through those neurological connections could perform other functions. If you change that,
that's getting back to
really
Subutai's point.
Yeah.
Those are famous experiments from a guy named Bakirita, but it's called sensory substitution. But the clever thing about this is, it starts off feeling like your tongue is tingling, but after the user does this for a while, it starts feeling like vision. That is, again, vision feels like vision because it's not the different algorithm, it's just because of the nature of the patterns. And so if the patterns are on your tongue, you'll start seeing with your tongue. I mean, it's hard to believe, but anyway.
Yeah, but that's whatever. That point, moving from that point that I've got this computational element that is receiving signals from someplace, right? And all those computational elements perform similar processes, pattern recognition. And when you move that to now this reference model, which is, has such a historical aspect of it, and you walk into, your kitchen, the same kitchen you walked into ever, and then you acknowledge these plates are in a different place, or something's different about it. So you reset your model, you rewrite your model, but you leave the rest of the reference model the same, right? And so you're making this constant update to that model, and how you see those changes versus someone that maybe comes in new. Well, the person that comes in new, he has to rewrite the whole kitchen right into that model. It's whatever. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating, and it's what when you take that and you extend it to different human perceptions, it's really quite amazing. So I guess my question is, reference frames. How exactly the connectivity, and you talked a little bit about voting, and I guess it's in that voting that you create these connections, and the reference frames come together into a full form. Is that the right way to think about it?
Oh, not quite.
All right,
So, let's see. So, well, we talk about cortical columns.
Yeah.
Right? So the cortical column is this universal algorithm that's independent of sensory modality. And the cortical column is what really contains the reference frames. And that's what builds up structured models. And sort of the amazing thing that sort of comes out of this theory is that every cortical column has all of the functionality of a full brain. It can do everything that our brain can do, and this includes building that the neocortex can do. And it builds up very structured models of objects in the world, using what we call reference frames. So it builds up these sort of stable percepts of the world. And different cortical columns are getting inputs from different parts of our sensory apparatus. And so it's getting different things. And what happens in the voting process is that each cortical column is trying to figure out what's happening in the world, but it only sees a small part of the world, like seeing through a straw. And every other cortical column is seeing something else, and they use voting to disambiguate between all of the possible combinations and quickly hone in on the specific percept that's actually out there and the specific thing. So it's sort of, the voting relies on reference frames, but the voting is sort of independent.
Here's a good example of that. Let's say touch. If I were to ask you to reach into a black box and tell me what's in there, you could do it with one finger. And what you do with one finger, you'd have to move the finger around the object and touch it in different positions. And as you're doing, your brain's keeping track where it is and what it's sensing. But you can also reach in with a whole hand or two hands at once. And if you do that, you don't have to move as much. Like I might be able to sense it right in one sound. If I grab it, I'm like, oh, that's the coffee cup. And where with one finger, I have to move it. That's voting. Because all the parts of your finger code to different parts of your neocortex. Each part is sensing a small part of the world. They could, each one, understand what's going on if they could move around completely. But when they can vote together, they can say, okay, I'm touching this, you're touching that, what's the one thing that makes sense for all of us? Bingo, it's the coffee cup. So I think that's the voting, that's a good example of the voting.
And it also explains sort of how different sensors kind of interoperate. So there's something, you can hear something partially and see something partially. Each one of that's completely ambiguous, but because they're operating on the same algorithm and they use the same language of reference frames, they can actually vote and disambiguate what you're seeing.
So are these cortical columns, are they flat in architecture, or do they have, cortical columns receive raw sensory input, and then they build another set of cortical columns that are receiving cortical column outputs in that process? Or
it's both. Was that what you would say?
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to create the simplest brain I could take a single cortical column and give it one little sensory input, and it would learn models of the world. I can take a bunch of them in parallel, each one looking at a different part of a sensory apparatus, and they all learn models, and they vote and reach consensus. But these things are also connected hierarchically in the neocortex, meaning even though the neocortex is a sheet, some of these are getting direct sensory input, some are getting input from other cortical columns. And so the way this works is that much of what we learn is what we call compositional structure, meaning things are built of other things. A door is an object, but a door has doorknobs and hinges and latches. Those are separate objects too, right? And they may exist in other places. So a particular door is a compositional object of, oh, this door has a latch that looks like this and a hinge over here, and so that's actually learned in the hierarchical structure in the cortex. We think we understand this pretty well right now. So the world is built of things on things. Everything's a collection of other things. And that's a large part of how we learn. And that is when the cortical columns are connected vertically or hierarchically, but there's also a lot of them connected in parallel. So it gets quite complicated, but the thing that keep coming back to the thing that Subutai said. It's the same algorithm everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's higher up in the hierarchy or down low in the hierarchy or it's horizontal, different modalities. It's basically the same thing going on everywhere. And this gets to the fact if you want to build this stuff, like if you want to build it in silicon or in software, you don't have to build lots of different things. You just have to build a lot of one thing and know how to hook them together correctly. And that's how, by the way, that's how our brains got large so quickly. In evolutionary time, humans' brains evolved very rapidly to get large. And it did that by essentially replicating the same thing over and over again, which is a simple thing to do from an evolutionary point of view, as opposed to like, let's invent a new system and a new system and a new system. So we can do that. We can follow the same path of evolution in our AI systems.
So help describe in this model what the word, 2 words, intellect and wisdom.
Gosh.
That's yours.
I should take that.
Right? But you got to get to both of them because
Okay.
we got to get to that wisdom state.
Okay. Well, I'll take a crack at intelligence. You can describe wisdom.
Intelligence or intellect? Is that
Intelligence. Intelligence.
Okay. Go ahead, and I'll talk about wisdom.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about AGI today, that networks are intelligent, right?
Does everyone know that term? I don't know.
AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. That's sort of what
AIs,
people.
AIs that are smart as humans
Yeah.
in every way.
I mean, we haven't mentioned ChatGPT yet, but some people think, oh, it's at AGI level already. But anyway, so people are talking about intelligence a lot, and there's all of these really complex tests of when a system is actually intelligent or not. And to me, that sort of stuff really completely misses the mark. And so we can ask, what is intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. And we can get back to the thousand brains theory in a second, but if you think about, when is a system intelligent? Let's consider Einstein, right? Everyone will say Einstein was super intelligent, right? Extremely smart. What about Einstein as a 6-month-old baby? Was that person intelligent or not? Mm-hmm. And I think everyone would say a 6-month-old Einstein was actually quite intelligent, right? It's able to eventually come up with theories of relativity. But a 6-month-old Einstein would fail every single intelligence test that AI researchers use today, right? So that lets you think, what is intelligence? And when you get back to cortical columns and what we think the neocortex is doing is the ability to build models, to understand the world, understand any source of data, and be able to move around the world, cause things to happen and learn rapidly, learn these structured representations. That's really what intelligence is. And that's what the thousand brains theory tells you how that is kind of implemented in the brain.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting.
So now you can describe wisdom.
Because as a child grows, we're building this model of the world as we go. And it actually takes a while when you're young. Yeah. So let's not talk about, you asked about wisdom. So the problem with words like wisdom and consciousness is because they mean different, they're not very well defined, right? But let's try to take a sort of everyday average idea of wisdom. Imagine 2 people, their brains are equally capable, they're equally raw material is there, but we have different experiences in life, right? So maybe you study international relationships, and you study the history of conflict in the world and so on, and I haven't. I've studied brains. I wasted my life doing that. And so we're now looking at some problem, and you come up with an analogy for this problem, and you say, that's like the such and such conflict between, the Serbians and the blah, 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 and the Turks and blah, 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 and the answer is, maybe, I don't know what it is, and I say, wow, you're a wise person. You have this deep insight. That's because you have models of the world that I don't have, and so you can answer questions about the world that I can't. And you might say to me, well, I can tell you why, why your kids are acting weird or something. And then you might say, oh, you're a wise guy, because I studied the brain. But the point was that wisdom is when we take our model of the world, that we all have unique experiences. So we all have different depths and talents and skills. We all have the basic same raw computing power in our head, the same raw material. But we have different experiences and we have different models. And wisdom is being able to apply insights from one of those models, a prediction of some internal model that you have that most people don't have. And then we'd say you're wise. It's like, wow, and maybe took a lifetime to get that knowledge, right? It took maybe a lifetime of study to get to that understanding of how politics works or something. And that makes you a wise person. That's why we think of wise people as old people, because they've had a lifetime.
Yeah, they've seen.
I keep telling myself that, so hopefully it'll be
So
true.
you're wiser than me.
There's got to be something redeeming with me as I get older,
Yeah, and the value of age. Maybe as we apply this to understanding humans and applying it to machines, if you could talk a little bit about what does that look like? Understand I'm a hardware-centric guy, not a software-centric guy. So it looks like a small processor replicated 150,000 times. But talk to us about that, and talk to us a little bit about why this model is more applicable to certain problems or to ultimate adoption, I guess.
Yeah, so there are many facets to the question you asked. But one thing I want to point out is that AI, or neural networks as they're sometimes called, originally was inspired by neuroscience, but when you look at today's AI systems, none of the stuff that we talked about is actually implemented in today's AI systems. So whether you think about ChatGPT or deep learning or transformer networks or whatever, none of these concepts of building structured models are actually in there. And the consequence of that is that these systems are incredibly inefficient. They're very, very power hungry. You have to throw so much data at it, way more than any of us ever experienced growing up. And they're just not truly intelligent in the way we think of it. So by incorporating these principles, we can actually make these systems move towards being truly intelligent, much more efficient, be able to learn really quickly, and so on. So those are kind of, I think, there's some of the reasons why we might want to incorporate this. And I think the way to do it is kind of, as Jeff said, we don't have to build a really complex system. We have to build many copies of this one somewhat complex system, right? This cortical column. And now that we understand it, we have to implement different components of it, and we've talked about it in our published papers. We can implement them. It can actually be implemented on today's hardware. And we can make today's AI systems incredibly power efficient, incredibly data efficient, be able to learn continuously, and really build structured models of the world.
I think maybe I want to add something that Subutai said, but you kind of skipped over perhaps, is we have this sort of very deep understanding of how brains do these things. But as Subutai said, today's AI systems are in some sense very simple, very, very simple. They don't have any of this kind of complicated structure and reference frames and movements or any of this stuff. But Subutai and his team have figured out how to take some of the neural principles and apply them first to the existing systems. I kind of jumped over a bit there. So I think it's very clever. We're both trying to build these real brains, and he said, we can make this ChatGPT stuff much faster and cheaper and lower energy usage. I mean, dramatically so, by incorporating just a few of the principles from the brain. So we don't have to, we can still call it ChatGPT, but, and it still does the same thing, but and I'll let you talk to how much you want to talk about how you did that. But we can make these things run 100 times faster, 100 times less power. I mean, literally, 2 orders of magnitude improvements. And so this has just happened in the last, 6 months or something like that. So we're talking to people now about how to do this, and it's going to be, so it's not, Numenta as a company is not just building like this ultimate brain stuff, which we are, but we've also figured out how to accelerate or improve today's AI, and so we see a way of sort of implementing these pieces one at a time, over time, getting our way there, which I think is very exciting, because it makes it very real and valuable today. If you can take 100, reduce your energy consumption by 99%.
So let me dig into a couple things you said there. My understanding, and I would have been one of the people that kind of had the little hand down here on the AI, what I know and what I don't know about it. There are a number of applications where they are acting as pattern matching. If I'm looking at a friend or foe acknowledgement from a security processor, right? I've got a certain pattern of activity that I'm expecting to see, and when I don't see that expectation, I said, hey, we've got to go check further. We got to shut this activity down because it's too much risk. That, to me, that is a pattern match. You've told it what pattern you're looking for, and possibly that the processor has the ability to learn from its experiences what other patterns it should see, and that. What isn't it doing that it hasn't built, or it has built a reference frame relative to?
Well, it's not using references, but here's one simple way to think about it. Today's AI requires that you train on millions, if not billions, of samples.
Right.
And you have to do it again, over and over again, if you ever want to train something new. And even then, it gets pretty brittle. Makes some really stupid mistakes, sometimes. I don't know if you've seen these images where, like, it's identifying pictures, and you show a picture of a banana, and it calls it a school bus. High confidence, it's a school bus. So humans don't make those mistakes. So these systems work today, but they take huge amount of training time. They can't be trained again. And sometimes they make ridiculous mistakes. So what humans do is we learn continuously. We don't have to go through gazillion training examples, millions and billions of training examples. You show me something new and I say, you know, Dave, next time you see that thing, you look at it for a few seconds, okay, I'll let you know. And you're not going to fool it, you know, you're not going to confuse a banana for a school bus. So there's these capabilities that are lacking in today's AI that are shortcomings. And they're cost shortcomings, they're environmental shortcomings, they're security and safety shortcomings. They work really well, but they have these shortcomings. So, and they don't use reference frames, by the way. It's brute force. It's just like, just pile on the data.
And you could see this today even with ChatGPT. If you try to use ChatGPT at all, you'll quickly run into this, you know, it gives you the statement as of, you know, whatever, June 2021, when I was trained, I only know this amount of stuff. And if you think about why is it that way? Why hasn't OpenAI and Microsoft, with all of their tremendous resources, retrained it? I mean, it's now 2 years old, and 2 years is an eternity. I mean, there's a lot that's happened in the last couple of years.
I think, I'm not sure everyone knows who you're talking about, but the thing is that these systems were trained 2 years ago.
Yeah,
They've trained them since.
Exactly.
Right, so they don't know anything that happened
Yes.
in the last 2 years.
So Microsoft trained, you know, finished training in 2021. They bolted on some facts, so it's not like it doesn't know anything new, but it knows very little that's happened since then.
It's pandemic trained.
It's pandemic trained, yeah. Well, it doesn't know the pandemic has ended, right? So to say. So, you know, and as Jeff was saying, these systems are not continuously learning. And it's extremely, inefficient and expensive to retrain these systems. So this has
why don't we retrain it? Because it costs, you know, tens and tens of millions of dollars to train it once.
Yeah, or $100 million.
$100, and you have to spend, you know, you have to burn enough CPU to mount that iPhone.
Yeah. So maybe it's weird, and maybe the audience might not realize this. You know, there's deep learning as a technology doesn't actually learn; it's static, and there's a separate learning phase that happens offline. But it's not constantly learning. So there's a training phase and an inference phase, which is just bizarre if you think about it. As humans, there's no such thing as a training phase and an inference phase. We're constantly learning. I mean, you and I are both learning as we sit here, and tomorrow we'll be able to remember what we did and talk about it. So there's no separation between training and learning.
I think I'm going to be wiser tomorrow.
So if I get down to my hardware-centric viewpoint, I am not going to reach out to the infinite memory stash of my information. I'm going to reach out to some subset of that, of which I am constantly moving at.
You take your world experiences, you build this internal model. You can learn efficiently because you move through the world. You select the things you want to perceive. You select what stuff you're going to look at.
And so how would voting come into this?
I mean, voting, you know, allows us, you know, each cortical column can learn, you know, as we talked about earlier, models of small bits of the world. It can do that very efficiently. And by piecing together data from lots of different sources, it's allowed to come, you know, it can come to conclusions much more rapidly. It can learn, because we're building structured models of the world, we can learn new things extremely quickly. You know, let's say, you know, we already know what cars look like. If you show me a new car, maybe I have never seen an electric car before, and you show me something, I can quickly, you know, place it in reference to other cars that I know, note the differences, as Jeff's just talked about, and, you know, boom, I know what that car is. I don't need to see millions of examples of that car in every lighting condition, every color, every viewpoint. I just instantly know.
Here's a really simplistic way. You seem to like voting, Dave, but here's a very simplistic way to think about voting. Voting is an efficiency mechanism in the brain. It's a way of getting answers quickly. By having lots of different models active at the same time, lots of different sensory inputs at the same time, I can reach a conclusion without having to move as much. Right? Again, if I'm trying to see is there a dangerous animal out there? Is it someone who's going to eat me or someone I can eat? Right? Well, if I had to look at the world through a straw, I could do that. And I'd be okay. I think it's a tiger. I won't do that. But when you have these things working in parallel and they vote, you get the instant like that. So in theory, you could build a really, really smart machine that was much slower because it had to move its little sensor everywhere. But in the inference phase, when we want to get an answer quickly, voting allows it to happen very quickly. It's a very expensive mechanism, by the way. Our brain, our neocortex is huge, and it consumes a huge amount of your personal energy. I mean, and it causes people to die during birth. I mean, it's a very costly organ. But one of the reasons it's so big is it allows us to get these inferences very rapidly, and voting allows that to happen rapidly. It's one way to look at it.
So I could talk forever, as you probably figured that part out. Maybe I can open up to some questions from the audience here. I think I see one in the middle, gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, hi, thank you for this very interesting talk. So I've watched some of the videos at Numenta, and I wanted to ask you about a couple of things. Features, number one. One of the videos, the guy said, well, if you take these, he was looking at representations of SDRs and saying, well, if you take African American and female and currently living, then, Beyonce would fit this pattern, but not, I guess Aretha Franklin at this point. But could you talk a little bit about what kind of features, do you guys have an interface that you can feed features into from which, the patterns can then be seen that are generalized?
Yeah, I guess the question is, how does our system represent features? How do we get features as input? Do sparse distributed representations or SDRs?
This person asking the question knows a lot because he just threw out SDRs here, which I think most people have no idea what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, so how are features sort of represented in our systems or acted on and stuff? And it's a really interesting question. I mean, when we think about features, I mean, what is a feature? Often when you're doing computer vision and things, some of the things people describe as features are stuff like edges or corners or little rounded shapes and things like that. And if you actually think about it, the inputs that are coming in, let's say for a vertical edge, I could be tilting my head, I could be moving my eyes around. The actual input that's coming into my eye for a single vertical edge is constantly changing, but I just perceive it as a vertical edge. And what's going on there is the most elemental thing that we just talked about, that in cortical columns, when we say it builds up a structured model of the world, at the very lowest level, at the smallest level, it's building up stable percepts of things that are actually stable in the world. So an edge, a vertical edge is not a set of pixels that's vertical, it's actually this physical thing that's vertical, right? And I can represent this physical thing as vertical regardless of my viewpoint to it. That's an example of a structured representation of something that's out in the world. And we do that with reference frames. So then those are things that are learned. There's learned in cortical columns, and the algorithms that are used to learn that is the same algorithms that are used for everything else in thought.
So I'll agree with all that. I'm going to add a little bit more, and this is a little bit deep, and we don't want to get too deep on these things here. But this is actually a very deep question, and what is a feature in the world? And our understanding of it has improved significantly over the last year, and we haven't talked about this at all publicly. One is, if you were asking in a practical sense how we're doing this right now, we're building systems now that work with vision and touch. And it turns out that a key component of building these models is the morphology of an object, or the shape of the object. And so we actually, in our vision systems, for example, we are looking at what we call point normals, which is essentially the tangential plane of a surface as one type of critical feature that can be detected. So there's a lot. I said earlier that the details of this theory are complex, and they are. And so we can slide into those, but we're going to lose most of the people here. But I think you're exposing some of that. Even things that sound simple, like a feature, are not simple at all. And it takes a great deal of thought and bang your heads together over a long period of time to really get at the core of what's going on there. And we don't have all the answers, but we have a lot of them. So I think there's more depth to the answer to your question that I'm willing to give here today.
Okay. Yeah.
Mohammed, I'm from Accenture, and we had the pleasure of having Subutai give a talk to Accenture Labs. I'm a data scientist there, and I have an unorthodox background, so maybe some of my questions may come off as strange. But I read your book, congratulations. It kept me awake a few nights until I finished it. So, by the way, I have 20 questions here, but I want to respect, so I'll just cherry pick 2, and then I can, if you don't mind, I can ask everything later.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk, and so one scientific and one imaginary question. Scientific is, what's the importance of the number 150K cortical column? Because as an engineer, I can think of a hyperparameter for this system. Like, does it mean, like, let's say if our life evolved on a different planet, maybe the environment was faster moving, or that we had more harsher environment, does it mean that the intelligence in the same time scale maybe needed more than 150K?
Okay, do you mind if I take that?
Go for it.
So we're mammals.
Correct.
All mammals have a neocortex. A mouse, tree shrew, cats, dogs, monkeys. It's a mammal, it's got neocortex. All mammals' neocortex are structured the same. They all have cortical columns. In fact, we study mice brains because the mouse cortical column is a very good model for a human cortical column. Now, the difference between a mouse cortical neocortex and a dog's and a cat and a human is not, to the first order approximation, is just how many cortical columns there are. There are actually some other differences, but not that much important. And so we can see that by the definition we say of what makes an intelligent system, the ability to learn to model the world through movement, a mouse qualifies. It has the same algorithms we have. It learns the same way we learn. It uses the same internal mechanisms we learn. And so now the question is, what's the evolutionary advantage of having a lot of these? And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cost to having a big one, right? We have huge energy consumption needs. We die in birth, you know, our heads don't fit things, you know. And it's a big environmental cost, I mean, a life cost to have a big brain like this. And clearly it's helped us out. It doesn't always help. You know, Neanderthals had bigger cortexes than humans do, and our species does, and they went extinct. So it was kind of on the edge there for a while, you know. And but now with something we just blossomed in the last, few 100,000 years, and humans have taken over the earth, for good or bad. So what is the advantage? Is maybe not obvious at first, but clearly one of the advantages is if we take the time to really learn a deep model of the world, which could take 20 years in a human, right? We take 20 years before we're functioning, 5 years before you can even survive on your own. And so what we gain from that is we gain this deep insight about how the world works and how other animals work and how we can then learn to live in different environments. And so, I mean, that's a very simple answer. I mean, you can ask, it allows us to build deep models and see the structure of structures. So where other simpler mammals wouldn't see that. They would have a much more shallow understanding. They wouldn't have that hierarchy I was talking about earlier. So this comes to play if we can learn to be 20 years old, and we can get all the food we need, and we can live in safe environments, and all of a sudden now we can start building computers and tools and do things that other animals can't do. And that's the advantage of it. But I just want to make you understand that a mouse and a rat and a human and a cat and a dog basically are all working on the same thing. They all have the same structures in their brain as we do, and we just have more cortical columns. That's a really close approximation to the truth on that one.
And then my second part is for Subutai, if you don't mind. Since you borrowed, I like the analogy you said, like as a computer scientist, these models like a templates, or the model in the cortical system. Do you think, given proper experimental setup, which I have no idea how ethical it is, can we train some, like let's say a child, to learn to experience like 4 dimensions?
Yeah, so can a child learn 4 dimensions?
No, experience it like real. Because I think that the capacity of every cortical, it doesn't matter. Like it's definitely more than 3 dimensions or high dimensional capture. But I don't know how to feed it to start learning that experience. But is it theoretically possible?
Yeah, and psychologists have done this experiment. So you can get exposed to 4-dimensional objects, and at first it feels completely bizarre. It's completely unpredictable. But after you've been exposed to it for a while, it sort of pops into your head. You can actually kind of understand this 4D object. I think this was like a 4D cube that this experiment was done. But it's not natural for us. And so a lot of the stuff that we have in our brain is oriented more towards lower dimensional systems like 3 dimensions.
I think
and so on.
theoretically,
There's
the way this thing works, the way these reference frames work, is built up a bunch of one-dimensional things, and there's a lot of them, and so they could, in theory, represent 4, 5, 6 dimensions if you lived in a 4, 5, 6 dimensional world.
Yeah, I think there is a bottleneck there. The amount of space that's occupied, it grows, exponentially with the number of dimensions. The amount of data you need to train really grows fast. So it's just from a practical. It's a curse of dimensionality.
This the same algorithm works for everything we do, what we call high-level thought and concepts and so on, language and mathematics and literature and so on. And you can ask yourself, how many dimensions are to that? What we think is going on is that these algorithms in the brain make no prior assumptions about the dimensionality of the things we're dealing with. Most of the world we deal with is 3-dimensional. Some of it's 2-dimensional. Some of it's 1-dimensional. I think that things we actually relate to in the world. But the algorithms themselves seem to, as best we understand them, seem like they could live in any dimensional space. There is this issue that you just talked about, dimensionality, capacity issues. But it's a fascinating topic that there's very little assumptions about what the world's going to be. According to the neocortex, there's other parts of your brain and other parts of your body are really like designed for this world. The neocortex is sort of this thing that I can learn anything. And you just give me the data and I can learn it. And including other weird dimensions in other abstract spaces, which is fascinating, really. We've evolved of this lots of species, really tuned to their environment. And then the mammals came along with the neocortex, which was small at first. And then when it get really, really big, all of a sudden we can start learning stuff that other animals have absolutely no idea what we'd be talking about.
Yeah, it goes back to this idea of having a very generic, powerful learning algorithm that's everywhere. And whether we're doing mathematics or learning how to use PowerPoint or driving a car, evolution didn't,
If we think about the future of AI, where this is going to go, it's mind-blowing, actually, because we can build systems that can get around all these capacity limits, and they can learn structure that at the moment we can't even. I don't know if it exists, but it would be difficult for either of us to think about. But not in a dangerous way. Don't take that as we were asked before this thing, do we think AI is going to end humanity? And both of us answered absolutely not.
So I got a few questions. I've got. I'm going to go first one over here. Yeah.
Gil Russell, WebPeak Research. We've come to the conclusion that there are clusters of neurons that are basically waiting for a pattern to occur, and when that pattern occurs, they fire or avalanche. And the idea behind this is that the idea of avalanche is that it's a very power-saving capacity.
Do you have a question, or is this a
Well, the question is, have you considered it?
I think you bring up a broader question, which I maybe would like to try to address. The brain is made of neurons. Neurons are biological cells, and they communicate using these chemical electrical spikes, and it's very power efficient. We are building these systems. Subutai is building systems. They are not made of neurons. They're running on computers using software and silicon. And there's a huge amount of concern. Will that be sufficient from a power point of view going forward? Because brains are so efficient, and computers doing equivalent things are much, much less efficient. I think it's a separate, parallel task and problem. Our task is to understand how the brain works and start implementing it. The best way to do it right now is in software. In Subutai's, he didn't tell you this, but we can now run these very large language models on local CPUs and phones and things like that, because we've really reduced the power requirements. But that doesn't mean in the future we're not going to come up with new memory models and new physics. There's a lot of people want to use emristers and different things like this. That's a separate question, is how do you accelerate? It'd be a little bit like, again, I always like to talk about the history of computing. Turing and Van Neumann invented the computer algorithm, if you will, but the transistor was invented later, right? You didn't need to have a transistor to understand how computers work. But they couldn't be really built efficiently until someone invented the transistor. we're in the stage where we're building the things, and we haven't, maybe we're going to need to invent a transistor, maybe it's the SOC stuff, maybe it's something else. We don't need it right now. Right now, we can just build what we got. In the future, there will be new physics and new materials and new ways of doing this stuff, but that's not our job. That's other people. Maybe that's your job. But that's not what we felt we needed to do right now. We needed to understand this algorithmically, mathematically, and it turns out we can build this stuff not as big. We're not building a human brain. We have a team that's just trying to build one cortical column, right? And it's a pretty daunting challenge, but it's going well. So how to scale up to human scale? You have to get to that eventually. I don't know if you had to add anything to that.
No, I think, of course, I agree with everything you just said, but
Well, that's not true in everything.
not always true.
Not in the
Not always
office.
true.
Why'd you say that here?
Because you're wise.
Oh, I'm older. That's what you're saying.
But sort of kind of to expand on that, one of the key innovations that we've done over the last 6 months is taken all this theory that we've talked about, and you talk about hardware architecture. There's today's hardware architectures, particularly those used in AI, have very specific architectures. They're designed to do a few operations in parallel, in mass. SIMD operations, and they tend to have certain memory bottlenecks and memory hierarchies. GPUs and CPUs. They have these sort of characteristics, and what we figured out is how to take some of these theories and algorithms and lay them onto today's hardware architecture in the way that such that we can get these 100x or 1000x speedups. So we can do a lot of that today, and that has tremendous practical value today. But looking ahead, today's architectures have fundamental limitations, and so we know that there will be changes that need to be made to the circuit to really enable these cortical algorithms to go 1,000,000 times faster. Right? So we can address today's architectures with it, but there is a long roadmap of new hardware.
And discovery. I think people, just like people didn't anticipate the transistor, who the hell knows what people are going to invent? Once these algorithms are out there, people are going to come up with clever ways of doing them.
The key is going to be SDRs like that.
So I got a bunch of hands that are popping up. There's one in the middle. Back there. Go ahead. You. There you go.
I have two related timing questions. How quickly do you see people like OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, or others implementing some of the changes that you described to get this 2 orders of magnitude improvement of performance and power? And then related to that, how many years will it be before we actually see AI running on ideas like what you're talking about?
Yeah, so we can't speak for OpenAI and Microsoft. I don't know what they're going to do, but I can tell you they could use this stuff. They've openly talked about some of the limits that they are seeing, with GPT, and a lot of the cost, given the tremendous popularity of ChatGPT today, they are struggling with figuring out how to manage the tremendous compute load that's imposed on them. So, I definitely think they should use it. They would benefit greatly from it.
By the way, some of them are aware of this, and we're talking to some of those people. I mean, unless something else comes along that's it's much better. It's crazy not to do this, and this is already recent. ChatGPT. When did that come around? It was like the fall, right? Come on. Even Silicon Valley doesn't move this fast. And and we're just proving this stuff out. In the last few months, we're showing how this stuff works in these large language models. So it will happen.
It will happen. And in terms of when will it be used? Well, it's already being used today, and early versions of this stuff was used several years ago in practical applications, and the stuff we're talking about today is we're working with customers today to.
That's the early stuff. I think he might have also been asking about the whole reference frame cortical column thing. I'm not sure if he was asking about that.
Okay.
That's a little further out.
I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and then we'll wrap it up. In the very back.
I'm Douglas. I'm Menlo School faculty. Research has shown that humans are really bad at detecting fake news. And one of the things that we're trying to do with our young people is trying to hone their BS detectors before they go off to college. The earlier versions of AI were prone to online pranksters sort of giving them bad data and then having them come to different conclusions. And I'm curious, what strategies are there to sort of insulate these new generations of AIs against bad information?
You want to take a
I
crack?
have a very sort of large scale answer to that
Yeah,
question.
and I can give a finer
maybe
scale
you
one.
You want to start with the finer scale one, and then, or you want me to go first?
I can do the finer scale one first. I mean, if you look at today's systems, they're essentially pattern matching systems. They're looking at the statistics of the world and using they're generating text. Right? So whenever you have something that's very basic like that, it's very possible to manipulate it. If you can understand the math behind it and the statistics, you can fake it or fool it in a way. One of the ways around it, using the kinds of stuff like the theories we're talking about, is enabling those systems to build models of the world that are more structured. So today's systems don't really have any sense of understanding of the world. They don't really know about the structure, the 3D structure.
That ChatGPT would tell you about a cat. It really doesn't know what a cat's like.
Yeah, it doesn't know what a cat is. It can tell you what words are commonly used in the internet to describe a cat, but it doesn't really understand a cat.
Right.
But when you, you can build in these structured models, it can actually understand at a much more visceral level of what the world is and what cats and dogs actually are. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it's going to be much harder to fool with fake news. So when you say, teaching these kids how to, a lot of what you have to do is teach them about the world, about what's real and what's not, and making logical conclusions and things like that. And that's stuff that still needs to be built into AI systems.
I think I want to address the question as an educator, which I appreciate. And I think I wrote a whole chapter on this in the book, or at least a subsection of the chapter. I see this as a really fundamental problem for humanity. We build a model of the world. I mentioned earlier, your perception is not the real world, it's your model. And it's really impossible to tell the difference. Now, the only way we know is the scientific method. The only way we know to tell whether your model is incorrect, you have fake beliefs, is to seek out contrary evidence. That's the only way we know. And that's the scientific method. It's not to seek out supporting evidence. It's to seek out contradictory evidence. It's to search, and it's so against our human nature to go and say, I want to find the things that tell me I'm wrong. Now, and then you have to filter those, because some of the things that tell you I'm wrong are wrong themselves. And so I see this as a real fundamental problem as we go forward for humanity in our long-term survival. Because I don't have to go through it. We all know what's going on in the world. We all know how we conform. People have formed completely different beliefs on the same matter. And and it's not just, I always think it's easy to see this like in religions. People believe different things, and they can't all be right? Someone's got to be wrong. But they all believe it. And it's true about everything. So that's the answer has to be somehow we have to institutionalize the uncomfortable action of finding contrary evidence, but humans don't want to do that. Yeah. And but that's the only way is to invalidate your model, because if you don't have contrary evidence to the model, then you're going to think it's right. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason not to think it's right, because everything you experience satisfies the model. It's a really troublesome issue, and I appreciate you thinking about it.
Let's see, you've been patiently waiting.
Absolutely. When you're talking about the same algorithm, it's running again and again, how do we really know that's the same algorithm? Are we oversimplifying that because of our lack of knowledge? And if that's not true, if that's really the same algorithm, is it as simple as logistic regression and then you need a backprop? This is how brain work, or
So I guess the question is, how do we know it's the same algorithm in all of these cortical columns? Is there a lack of knowledge, and is it just some simple logistic regression and backpropagation, or is it something more complex? I think that goes back to the neuroscience, and neuroscience as a field has exploded over the last 50, 60 years, particularly over the last 20, 30 years. There's a tremendous amount known specifically on those topics. And there's a preponderance of evidence that suggests that there really is a common algorithm on there, and we can get into the details of it, but just kind of trust me, there is a lot of evidence on that.
This topic has been debated.
It's been debated, yeah.
And
And so, and it's not as simple as logistic regression followed by backpropagation. There's a lot more structure that's involved in that. And so, the process of building up these structured models of reference frames, the process of acting on the world, initiating movement, and having predictions on that movement, and then checking on those predictions, learning very rapidly. Those sorts of things are all part and parcel of this cortical algorithm.
If you look at a cortical column and you look at the anatomy and the physiology of it, it's really complicated. This is not simple. There are dozens and dozens of cell types, and they're connected in very specific ways, and they work together in various different methods and phase oscillations and so on. And that structure is replicated everywhere. This is not a simple thing. It's a really complex thing, and the anatomy is nearly identical everywhere. And this is why neuroscientists can study the rat's whisking sense and know it applies to human vision, because it basically seems to be doing the same thing. So just pointing out, I just want to emphasize, it's not a simple thing. It's a complex thing. But as soon as I said, there's a tremendous amount of evidence. It was first proposed in the, I'm going to forget the name. It was 74 or something like that. I forget the date. And he started out by, he went through, this guy, Vernon Malcolm, went this huge list of evidence, like why I'm making this crazy algorithm, I'm making this crazy statement that all these things are the same, and here's all my evidence for it. And that was back then, and now there's a huge amount more evidence for it. So we just, at this point, it's not really debatable in the neuroscience world.
Yeah. I think you had one right here in the middle, and then we're going to have to start wrapping up here, but go ahead.
I had trouble reconciling On Intelligence from 2004 with 1,000 Brains in the particular way. Your first book was Intelligence is Prediction, broadly speaking. 1,000 Brains moves to a more of a model-based understanding of intelligence and learning. And I guess I'm maybe too stuck on intelligence as prediction. I want to just, how does that, is that really?
It's still there.
Is it predictive coding and all these things are all similar?
It's not predictive coding, that's a very specific thing that means something. It's still making predictions, and a second reading, I must not have written it very well, but a second reading about 1,000 Brains, I talked about this very issue. You might find it in there. I'm sorry, if I didn't write it well, I'm sorry. But the key to understanding how the brain, how the cortex works was start with prediction. We understood the brain is constantly making predictions about everything, all the time, all your sensory input. And then we just unraveled that problem. How could it make predictions under different scenarios? How could it do this? And the reference frame model is still a predictive model. And the way we got to that reference frame model is asking, how does it make predictions when you move? How does your brain make predictions when your fingers are moving over surfaces, your eyes are moving through this world? So On Intelligence, my first book, was all about, like, we can understand how this thing works, and we're going to, and it's a predictive organ, that's the key to understanding it. But we didn't actually know, I didn't know how it did that exactly. In 1,000 Brains, we now know a lot better how it does that, like kind of crack that code, but and although I didn't focus on the term prediction, it's still underlying everything. I walked through in the book how we use prediction under different scenarios to unravel this algorithm and determine the reference frames. So it's still there. It's like one said, here's how we're going to do it, and the other one says, oh, here's how it actually works. We did it now. At least I tried to make it look like that, but clearly I didn't succeed. So sorry.
So you see lots and lots of hands, and I think we might need to be at least respectful for other people. Who are you? Are you voting for someone to get the back to voting? All right, go ahead. Last one, then we're gonna have. You can come on up and on stage and get to.
All right. Well, my name is Get, and I don't know much about AI nor brain science. So my questions would be like, is this like AGI? And if deep learning is not a right technology for AGI because it's static, are you guys building that technology? And if you're a company, what's your vision for what's your product you build, or you're non-profit?
Okay, but do that under 2 hours.
Yeah. You take
10 seconds.
Okay, I guess the question is,
This is a good point to summarize, you know.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking too. Yeah, I guess the question is, what is the state of the technology today, and what do we think? Where do we think it should go, right? And so, very quickly, I mean, obviously, deep learning and GPT models, ChatGPT today are the state of the art, as I think most of you know. Those systems are tremendously capable. They're very useful. They do a lot of stuff, but they're not intelligent, and they don't have they're not implemented using principles of the brain. And so what we think should happen, and what we are building as a company, is incorporating principles from neuroscience, principles of how we think the brain is actually implementing intelligence and how it's doing into artificial systems. And by doing that, we'll be able to build systems that are tremendously power efficient, are able to learn continuously, build structured models of the world, be able to move around and interact, build hypotheses, do counterfactuals like Jeff was talking, and do all of the stuff that's necessary to have truly intelligent systems. So that's what we're doing.
So I'm gonna throw in, and you can correct me on my facts, and we'll wrap it up here. My understanding of the brain is it has I'm a telecom guy, so it has about an 8 megabit I/O. Right? But I want to put this in the context of my silicon alternative. 8 megabits I/O. If you're burning 20% of your calories, you're burning 400 calories a day to maintain this on a 24/7, versus my silicon, which is burning thousands of watt hours of energy if it was running 24 hours a day. And it's frankly, its mass is much greater, and the I/O that can go into it is much greater, but the level of intellect of our brain is just so far advanced compared to the level of intellect of silicon, which is not even close. So the inspiration to follow what biology has figured out and how to do this, and the ability to solve amazingly complex problems on a per watt basis, the brain outperforms silicon infinitely, right? And following those processes is truly, it absolutely has to be the right direction. It's the existence proof that shows where this is
good
going.
summary.
And while I applaud you guys for perseverance to really make it happen. And society thanks you today, and they're going to really thank you later.
Well, we'll see. We're working at that. We're trying to make that happen.
So I want to take the opportunity to first thank the audience, thank everyone for coming out for just a lively discussion on a really interesting topic, and taking your evening time with us. I want to thank Menlo School again for the hospitality that they've shown this group, and the interest they've had in the topic. Jeff Subutai, thank you so much for your time and your commitment to this.
Well, thanks for having me.
With that.